The easiest way to steal from hundreds of honest families isn't with a mask or a gun. It's with a smile, a polished financial report, and the words, "Trust the board." The stale smell of burnt coffee hung over the Willow Creek clubhouse as nearly 200 homeowners settled into their folding chairs, shuffling papers, and exchanging the same tired complaints they'd been repeating for months. The air conditioner rattled overhead, struggling against another humid Georgia evening, while fluorescent lights buzzed softly above us. I sat halfway down the center aisle, balancing a printed copy of the annual financial statement on my knee, something I always did out of habit. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 43 years old, a certified public accountant, and after nearly 2 decades auditing corporations, nonprofit organizations, and family businesses, I'd learned one lesson that never failed. Numbers don't lie. People do. My wife used to joke that I couldn't enjoy dinner without mentally balancing the restaurant's books. Maybe she wasn't wrong. We moved into Willow Creek 4 years earlier because we wanted quiet streets, safe sidewalks, and neighbors who actually waved when you drove past. Our daughter Emma had just started middle school, and this neighborhood looked like the kind of place where people trusted each other. That's why what happened next still keeps me awake some nights. Linda Crawford stood confidently behind the podium, wearing a cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Her smile was polished, practiced, and just warm enough to make newcomers believe every word she said. She thanked everyone for supporting another successful year, praised the community for investing in its future, and announced that the board would be requesting an additional $12,000 special assessment from every homeowner to address what she called unexpected infrastructure expenses. A low murmur spread through the room. Someone behind me whispered that the pool filtration system still hadn't been repaired. Another neighbor quietly reminded his wife that the front security gate had been broken for almost 8 months. Across the aisle, Mrs. Henderson, a retired schoolteacher who had lived here since the subdivision opened, slowly raised her hand. Her voice trembled as she explained that she was already living on Social Security and had borrowed money from her son to pay the last assessment 6 months earlier. She asked a simple question. Where did the previous money go? Linda never lost her smile. She adjusted the microphone, thanked Mrs. Henderson for her concern, and calmly replied that every dollar had been properly allocated according to board-approved expenditures. Then she flipped to the next slide before anyone could ask another question. That's when something caught my eye. Not a missing page. Not an obvious mistake. Just one number sitting quietly near the bottom of the reserve account summary. $247,913.18. My eyes narrowed. My fingertips stopped moving across the paper. The room faded into the background as every instinct I developed over 20 years whispered the same thing. That number didn't belong there. It wasn't just unusual. It was mathematically impossible. For the rest of that meeting, I barely heard another word Linda Crawford said. The applause, the questions, even the scraping of folding chairs across the clubhouse floor blurred into background noise while my eyes stayed fixed on that single line inside the reserve account summary. I had seen numbers like that before, not in neighborhood associations, but in corporate fraud investigations where someone assumed nobody would ever look closely enough to ask why the math refused to balance. Most people think accountants memorize tax laws and spend their lives buried behind calculators. The truth is we spend far more time studying people than spreadsheets. Every fraudulent transaction leaves behind a fingerprint because someone eventually gets comfortable enough to repeat a pattern. That was the thought echoing through my mind as I folded the report with careful precision and slipped it into the same black leather portfolio I had carried to every audit for the last 15 years. I always kept copies of every financial statement our association released. My wife, Sarah, teased me about it whenever another thick binder appeared on the bookshelf in my home office. She called them my neighborhood history books. I laughed every time because she thought I was simply organized. She never realized I kept them because numbers tell stories, and stories only make sense when you remember every chapter. We drove home with the windows down because the evening air felt cooler than the stale clubhouse. Emma was in the back seat talking about her upcoming science fair, completely unaware that I had barely spoken since the meeting ended. Sarah glanced at me while we stopped at a red light. She knew that expression. I had worn it before after discovering irregularities during a hospital audit years earlier. She finally broke the silence. Something is bothering you, isn't it? I nodded without taking my eyes off the road. One number. She smiled gently. Only you could come home worried about one number. I wished she were right. After dinner, I carried my portfolio into the small office overlooking our backyard. The familiar scent of cedar shelves and fresh printer paper always helped me think. One by one, I removed every annual report, reserve study, monthly financial summary, and budget packet I had saved since moving into Willow Creek. For years of documents spread across my desk in perfect chronological order. I opened my laptop and built a simple spreadsheet, entering each reserve balance exactly as reported. The process was slow but comforting, almost like assembling a puzzle whose picture I had not seen yet. Then the pattern appeared. Every year the reserve account increased exactly as expected until 18 months earlier. From that point forward, the ending balance always looked reasonable on its own, but when I traced the deposits, expenses, and transfers line by line, the totals quietly drifted apart. Not by thousands at first, sometimes only a few $100s, then a few thousand, then tens of thousands. By the time I reached the newest report, the unexplained difference totaled exactly $247,913.18. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the quiet hum of my desktop computer and the distant chirping of crickets outside. That number had not appeared by accident. Someone had spent nearly 2 years teaching everyone in Willow Creek to stop looking closely. Unfortunately for them, looking closely happened to be the one thing I had spent my entire career doing. The next morning, I arrived at my office before sunrise, long before the phone started ringing or the coffee machine became the center of everyone's morning routine. The faint smell of fresh paper mixed with the familiar scent of copier toner as I unlocked my office and placed the Willow Creek financial reports beside a stack of client files. I should have been reviewing a manufacturing audit due later that afternoon, but my mind kept drifting back to Linda Crawford and the effortless confidence she carried into every community meeting. That confidence was not built overnight. It came from years of convincing people that asking questions somehow made you the problem instead of the solution. Linda had lived in Willow Creek almost twice as long as I had. She knew every homeowner by name, attended every holiday parade, sponsored every neighborhood charity event, and somehow managed to appear in every newsletter smiling beside another ribbon-cutting or landscaping project. New families admired her. Older residents defended her. Realtors loved her because she constantly talked about protecting property values. On the surface, she looked exactly like the kind of volunteer every community hoped to have. But over the past year, I had started noticing details that never quite fit together. Every major landscaping contract seemed to go to a different company with unfamiliar names. Every board meeting ended with another emergency expense that supposedly could not wait until the next budget cycle. Every financial question received a polished answer filled with complicated language, but remarkably few actual numbers. I remembered one meeting where a retired engineer politely asked for copies of vendor bids before the board approved a $180,000 clubhouse renovation. Linda smiled warmly, thanked him for his dedication, then explained that releasing confidential contractor information could expose the association to legal liability. Most people nodded and accepted the explanation. I remembered thinking it sounded impressive without actually answering the question. Another homeowner once asked why the reserve study recommended replacing the community entrance signs in 10 years when the board had already approved replacing them after only 3. Linda laughed softly and said modern materials required different maintenance schedules. Nobody challenged her because nobody had the documents sitting in front of them. She understood something many leaders forget. Confidence often sounds more convincing than evidence. During lunch, I searched our county business records, something any resident could legally access online. One landscaping company appeared only 8 months earlier. Another contractor listed on our financial report had been formed less than a year before receiving one of the largest maintenance contracts in the association's history. That alone proved nothing. New businesses win contracts every day. Still, I wrote each company name into my notebook. Years of auditing had taught me that individual facts rarely exposed fraud. Patterns did. Before leaving work, I drove through Willow Creek instead of taking my usual route home. Fresh mulch surrounded the entrance monument, but weeds pushed through cracks around the neighborhood sidewalks. The tennis court fencing sagged near the back corner. The pool furniture showed fading paint, and one of the security cameras still pointed uselessly toward the ground exactly as it had for months. We had spent more money than ever according to the reports, yet the neighborhood looked like a family carefully pretending everything was fine while ignoring a leaking roof. As I turned into my driveway, the late afternoon sun reflected off my windshield, and one quiet realization settled into my mind with unsettling clarity. Linda Crawford had spent years building trust inside Willow Creek. If I intended to challenge her story, I would need something far stronger than suspicion. I would need proof that even her closest supporters could not explain away. The following week, I stopped looking for one mistake and started looking for repetition, because that is where every financial trail eventually leads. Every evening after work, I sat at the same cedar desk, the soft glow of my desk lamp spilling across stacks of reports, while the quiet ticking of the wall clock reminded me how many hours disappeared without my noticing. Sarah would occasionally bring me a fresh cup of coffee, glance at the growing mountain of paperwork, and simply shake her head with a patient smile. She never interrupted. She knew that once I started following numbers, I would not stop until they told me the truth. I built a timeline covering every major expense approved during the previous 2 years: roof repairs, landscaping, pool maintenance, security upgrades, holiday decorations, irrigation improvements. At first glance, everything looked ordinary. Each payment had an invoice. Each invoice matched a board meeting approval. Each approval carried signatures from the treasurer and the president. It was almost too perfect. Honest bookkeeping is usually a little messy because real life is messy. Perfect records often deserve a second look. I began comparing contractor addresses with county business registrations. One company shared the same mailing address as another contractor with a completely different name. A third listed a post office box instead of a physical office. 2 businesses were registered within 6 days of each other despite supposedly having completed projects years apart. None of those discoveries proved wrongdoing by themselves, but together they formed something I recognized immediately. Someone had carefully arranged every document so that no single page looked suspicious. The pattern only appeared when the entire picture came into view. Then another detail surfaced. Every one of those companies received payments ending in unusual amounts, never rounded numbers. $12,486.21. $38,914.63, $41,207.47. It looked precise enough to discourage questions, yet nearly every invoice described work in broad language such as community maintenance, emergency repairs, or infrastructure support. As an auditor, I had learned that vague descriptions paired with extremely precise dollar amounts often deserved extra attention. One Saturday morning, I walked through Willow Creek carrying nothing more than a bottle of water and my phone. Birds chirped from freshly trimmed oak trees while sprinklers clicked rhythmically across neatly cut lawns. Families pushed strollers along the sidewalks. Children rode bicycles past the clubhouse, and everything appeared exactly as a well-managed neighborhood should. But once I started paying attention, the details refused to match the spending reports. The decorative lights around the entrance had several burned-out fixtures. Cracks spread across the walking trail near the retention pond. The benches installed only 3 years earlier already showed peeling paint. Even the newly renovated clubhouse deck listed in the financial report still had warped boards near the rear staircase. A retired neighbor named Harold was replacing flowers outside his front porch when he waved me over. He laughed and said he had volunteered twice to help repair the community garden because the association claimed there was never enough money in the maintenance budget. That sentence stopped me cold. Never enough money. According to the reports I had reviewed, maintenance spending had reached record levels. Yet residents were donating labor because they believed the association could not afford basic upkeep. As the warm afternoon breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass across the neighborhood, I looked toward the clubhouse where Linda's spotless sedan sat parked in its usual reserved space. The more I compared the records with the reality surrounding me, the more one unsettling thought settled into place. The missing money had not disappeared all at once. It had been quietly draining away while everyone admired reports instead of results. By Monday morning, I knew speculation was no longer enough. If the financial records were accurate, the board should have had no reason to hide them. Every homeowners association has governing documents, and ours clearly stated that members could submit written requests to inspect financial records within a reasonable period. I printed my request on professional letterhead from my home office, not because I wanted to intimidate anyone, but because I wanted every word to be clear, respectful, and impossible to misunderstand. I requested copies of the general ledger, vendor contracts, competitive bid documentation, reserve account statements, and invoices supporting the largest expenditures from the previous 2 fiscal years. Nothing unusual, nothing unreasonable, just the documents any responsible homeowner should have been allowed to review. I dropped the certified envelope into the post office mailbox just after sunrise, hearing the soft metallic click as it disappeared inside. That sound felt strangely final, like I had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. 7 business days later, an envelope arrived in my mailbox. I expected confirmation that my request had been received. Instead, I unfolded a 2-page letter from the association's attorney. The language was polished, formal, and remarkably cold. My request, according to the letter, was excessively burdensome, potentially disruptive to association operations, and included confidential business information protected from public disclosure. They offered to provide an annual summary report instead, the same report I already had sitting on my desk. I read the letter twice, then a third time. It never actually denied my right to inspect the records. It simply surrounded that right with enough legal language to discourage anyone from trying. That afternoon, I attended the monthly board meeting. The familiar scent of floor polish mixed with fresh coffee as neighbors filled the clubhouse once again. Linda greeted everyone with the same welcoming smile she always wore, thanking volunteers for decorating the entrance flower beds and congratulating a local family whose son had earned an academic scholarship. She knew exactly how to command a room without ever raising her voice. When homeowner comments began, I stood and calmly asked whether my records request would be honored. Every conversation in the room seemed to stop at once. Linda smiled politely before adjusting the microphone. She thanked me for my interest in transparency and explained that the association remained fully compliant with all applicable laws. Then she added that releasing incomplete financial materials without proper context could create confusion among residents. Several people nodded. A few even glanced toward me with expressions that suggested I was making unnecessary trouble. The board immediately moved on to the next agenda item. As neighbors gathered outside after the meeting, the atmosphere felt different. Conversations became quieter when I approached. One couple who normally chatted with us during weekend walks offered only a quick wave before turning away. Another homeowner gently suggested that perhaps I should trust the volunteers because they sacrificed so much personal time for the community. Nobody was rude. Nobody argued. But I could feel an invisible wall beginning to form. Late the next afternoon, my phone rang while I was finishing work. The caller identified himself as a former board member named Daniel Brooks. His voice remained cautious, almost hesitant. He said he had heard about my questions and wanted to meet somewhere away from the neighborhood. Before ending the call, he paused for several seconds and quietly said something that sent a chill through me despite the warm spring afternoon. "You are asking the same questions I asked 2 years ago, Ethan. Just be prepared. They do not like people who keep asking where the money goes." Daniel chose a small family diner 20 minutes outside Willow Creek, the kind of place where the coffee was always fresh, the booths were slightly worn, and nobody paid much attention to strangers talking quietly in the corner. Rain tapped softly against the front windows while the smell of bacon and toasted bread drifted through the room. He arrived 5 minutes late carrying a weathered canvas messenger bag that looked heavier than it should have. Daniel Brooks was in his early 60s, with silver hair, tired eyes, and the calm voice of someone who had spent years trying to avoid unnecessary conflict. He shook my hand firmly before sliding into the booth across from me. For nearly a minute, neither of us spoke. Finally, he unzipped the bag and placed 3 thick folders on the table. "I hoped I would never need these," he said quietly, "but I could never bring myself to throw them away." Inside were copies of board meeting minutes, handwritten notes, vendor payment summaries, and email printouts dating back almost 3 years. Daniel explained that he had served as treasurer for less than 11 months before resigning. At first, he believed the board simply suffered from poor bookkeeping. Then he started noticing that invoices often arrived after payments had already been approved. Vendor contracts appeared with missing pages. Financial reports distributed to homeowners did not always match the reports discussed during executive sessions. Every time he asked for clarification, Linda assured him everything had already been reviewed by professionals. The first real warning came when she suggested that he stop worrying about details because volunteers should trust one another. Daniel smiled sadly as he remembered that conversation. "Trust is earned with transparency," he whispered, "not secrecy." He reached into one folder and handed me a photocopy of an invoice for emergency irrigation repairs totaling $38,914.63. I immediately recognized the amount because I had highlighted it only 2 nights earlier. Attached behind the invoice sat an email chain discussing bids from 3 contractors. Except only one contractor had actually submitted a proposal. The other 2 companies listed on the comparison sheet had identical formatting errors, identical fonts, and identical spacing. They looked less like independent bids and more like documents created by the same person. My pulse quickened. Daniel watched my expression and slowly nodded. "Keep going," he said. "There is more." He pulled out another folder containing county business registration printouts he had collected before leaving the board. Several companies shared mailing addresses. Others listed registered agents connected through the same accounting service. One landscaping business had been incorporated less than 2 weeks before receiving a contract worth over $100,000. None of it proved a crime by itself, but together it formed a web too organized to ignore. Then Daniel handed me the final document. It was not an invoice or a meeting minute. It was a resignation letter he had written but never sent to the homeowners. In it, he described concerns about incomplete financial records and recommended an in-deep. The next 2 weeks became the most methodical investigation I had ever conducted outside my professional career. Every evening after dinner, Sarah would clear one end of the dining room table while I spread out financial statements, business registrations, meeting minutes, and Daniel's folders like pieces of an enormous jigsaw puzzle. The soft hum of the ceiling fan mixed with the occasional rustle of paper as Emma finished her homework nearby, completely unaware that our dining room had quietly become the headquarters for uncovering something much larger than a bookkeeping error. I built a master timeline showing every payment, every board vote, every newly registered contractor, and every special assessment collected from homeowners. The picture became clearer with every document. The same handful of businesses kept appearing under different names. Contracts were routinely approved only days after the companies themselves had been created. Emergency projects somehow skipped competitive bidding. Maintenance budgets grew larger every year, while the actual condition of the neighborhood steadily declined. By the end of the second week, I had filled nearly an entire wall in my office with printed charts connected by colored notes. Looking at it from across the room, it no longer resembled accounting. It looked like a map of relationships. Then another unexpected piece arrived. Harold, the retired neighbor I had spoken with near the community garden, knocked on my front door one Saturday morning carrying a weathered accordion folder. He explained that years earlier he had volunteered on the landscaping committee and had kept copies of every proposal submitted for neighborhood improvement projects. As we compared his documents with the invoices approved by the board, one detail immediately stood out. The proposal selected by the board was never the lowest bid, nor was it the most detailed. In several cases, the contractor whose proposal supposedly won had never actually attended the committee meetings where vendors presented their work. Harold stared quietly at the paperwork before shaking his head. "I always assumed they made decisions after we left the room," he said. "Now I am not so sure." That afternoon I contacted an attorney who specialized in community association law. Rather than accusing anyone, I simply showed him the timeline, the public records, and the inconsistencies. He spent nearly an hour reviewing everything without interruption. Finally, he leaned back, removed his reading glasses, and said something I had been hoping to hear. "If these documents are authentic, homeowners have the right to demand an independent forensic audit through a properly called membership vote." Those words changed everything. Until then, I had been collecting information. Now I had a lawful path forward. Over the following days, I quietly spoke with neighbors I trusted, never making accusations, only showing them objective facts. One by one, their expressions shifted from skepticism to concern. Mrs. Henderson remembered paying 3 separate special assessments that never seemed to improve anything. A young couple recalled being told there was no money to repair the neighborhood playground despite another increase in monthly dues. Even homeowners who admired Linda admitted they had never actually seen supporting financial records. We drafted a formal petition requesting an independent forensic audit exactly as allowed under the governing documents. Every signature was verified. Every page was copied. Every deadline was followed precisely. There would be no shortcuts because shortcuts create opportunities for doubt. As I sealed the completed petition inside a large certified mailing envelope, I noticed the total number of homeowner signatures written neatly across the cover sheet. We had collected support from more than 60% of the community. For the first time since that board meeting weeks earlier, I allowed myself a quiet smile. Linda had spent years convincing everyone to trust her words. Soon she would have to answer to the documents instead. The clubhouse reached capacity nearly 40 minutes before the special membership meeting officially began. Folding chairs lined every aisle. Neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder along the back wall, and the familiar scent of fresh coffee had been replaced by the sharper smell of anticipation. Nobody spoke very loudly. The quiet conversations that drifted through the room carried a different tone than previous meetings. People were no longer discussing landscaping or holiday decorations. They were waiting for answers. I sat beside our attorney with a neatly organized binder resting on my lap. Across the room, Linda Crawford entered wearing the same confident smile she had worn at every meeting for years. She greeted homeowners by name, thanked volunteers for attending, and carried herself as though nothing had changed. For a brief moment, I almost admired her composure. Then the independent forensic auditors wheeled a projector toward the front of the room, and the atmosphere shifted. The lead auditor introduced himself, explained that his firm had been granted complete access to the association's financial records, bank statements, vendor files, electronic accounting system, and publicly available business registrations. His voice remained calm and measured, the kind of tone built from years of presenting facts rather than opinions. The first slide appeared on the screen. It showed nothing more dramatic than a timeline. Every special assessment collected over the previous 5 years sat beside every major contractor payment. At first, the information looked ordinary. Then another slide appeared. Colored lines connected vendors sharing identical mailing addresses. Another chart displayed companies created only days before receiving six-figure contracts. Another demonstrated that several invoices had been approved before corresponding work orders were ever issued. Nobody interrupted. The only sound inside the room came from the soft clicking of the presentation remote. Then the auditor displayed the reserve account reconciliation. I recognized the number immediately. $247,913.18. The exact figure that had first caught my attention weeks earlier. Except now it sat beside bank transaction records, canceled checks, and transfer logs obtained directly from the financial institution. The unexplained difference was no longer an accounting curiosity. It was documented across multiple independent sources. The auditor carefully explained that the missing funds had not vanished through one transaction. They had been transferred gradually through overlapping payments to related vendors over an extended period. Every statement was supported by documents projected onto the screen. Linda's smile disappeared for the first time since I had known her. One board member quietly lowered his eyes toward the table. Another slowly removed his reading glasses and stared silently at the stack of reports in front of him. Homeowners who had defended every board decision sat motionless, reading copies of the audit summary being passed from row to row. Mrs. Henderson pressed a hand against her mouth as she turned each page. Harold closed his eyes for several seconds before quietly shaking his head. The auditor continued without emotion, identifying undisclosed conflicts of interest between certain contractors and individuals responsible for approving association expenditures. Every conclusion referenced supporting records, every chart cited original source documents, and every financial calculation matched independently verified bank statements. There was nothing left to argue because the evidence spoke more clearly than anyone in the room ever could. Finally, the association attorney stood and announced that, based upon the findings presented, the current board would immediately suspend further financial approvals pending additional legal review and cooperation with the appropriate authorities. A silence settled across the clubhouse unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was not the silence of confusion. It was the silence that arrives when assumptions finally collide with undeniable facts. Weeks earlier, everything had begun with one number that refused to make sense. Now, every missing dollar had found its place in the story. 3 months later, Willow Creek looked like the neighborhood my family thought we had purchased in the first place. Fresh paint covered the clubhouse. The broken security gate finally opened without hesitation. The walking trail had been repaired, and children once again filled the playground on Saturday mornings. The scent of newly planted flowers drifted across the entrance as volunteers worked side by side, instead of arguing at board meetings. The biggest change, however, was something nobody could see. It was trust. A special election brought in an entirely new board made up of homeowners with different professions, different opinions, and one shared promise. Every financial report would be published in full. Every contract above a predetermined amount would require competitive bidding. Every homeowner would have the right to inspect association records according to the governing documents without unnecessary delays. Monthly meetings were streamed online so families who could not attend in person could still watch every discussion. Transparency stopped being a slogan and became the new standard. The independent audit remained available for every resident to read, page by page, and although it was filled with accounting terminology that most people would never enjoy, it reminded all of us that communities survive only when accountability is stronger than convenience. Daniel Brooks accepted an invitation to serve as an unpaid financial advisor during the transition, finally seeing the recommendations he had written years earlier become reality. Harold returned to leading volunteer landscaping projects, except this time the approved budgets actually matched the work completed around the neighborhood. Mrs. Henderson smiled the first morning she saw contractors repairing the clubhouse roof because, as she quietly told Sarah, it felt good knowing her assessment payments were finally doing what everyone had been promised. As for me, I returned to my regular work auditing companies across the state. My office wall no longer held charts connecting vendor names or payment histories. Those papers had been archived where they belonged. Yet one item stayed framed above my desk. It was the first annual financial report from that meeting weeks earlier, open to the reserve account summary with one number circled in red ink. $247,913.18. Visitors occasionally asked why I kept such an ordinary page on display. I always smiled because to everyone else it looked like another spreadsheet. To me, it represented the exact moment an entire story began. It reminded me that truth rarely announces itself with flashing lights or dramatic speeches. Sometimes it hides inside a decimal point that nobody else notices. Looking back now, I never considered myself a hero, an investigator, or someone trying to challenge the neighborhood leadership. I was simply a homeowner who believed that if hundreds of hardworking families were contributing their money, those families deserved honest answers about where every dollar went. That belief changed our community far more than any accusation ever could. Linda Crawford had spent years asking everyone to trust her words. In the end, words were never enough. Bank statements, invoices, meeting minutes, and simple arithmetic carried far more weight than promises. Every missing dollar eventually found its trail because numbers always connect when someone is patient enough to follow them. I still drive through Willow Creek every evening on my way home from work, and sometimes I slow down near the clubhouse just long enough to watch neighbors talking outside while children ride their bicycles beneath the oak trees. The neighborhood is quieter now, not because people stopped asking questions, but because they finally learned that asking honest questions is exactly how strong communities protect themselves. Justice never arrived with sirens or applause. It arrived one document at a time, one verified fact after another, until the truth became impossible to ignore. And if my years as an accountant have taught me anything, it is this: numbers never seek revenge. They simply wait for someone willing to read them carefully.